All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jack Koziarski. I'm a CAN-SEBP Research Associate and a PhD student at the University of Western Ontario. And thank you for tuning in to a supplementary video for a June webcast. The recording of this webcast took a little bit of a unique turn. Our original attempt had some connection issues, so we unfortunately had to cut it short. In this video, we'll quickly summarize the questions that we were able to get through in the original recording, and then we'll jump to the questions that we weren't able to get to. And if you're not already aware, the topic for June's webcast is social networking gangs, and our guest again is Martin Bouchard, who is a professor of criminology at Simon Fraser University, where he leads the Crime and Illicit Networks Laboratory. So welcome again, Martin, and thank you for being such a great sport through the technical difficulties.
Well, thanks for having me a second time, especially since the first time it was my fault. For sure I'm a good sport. I think you're the good sport. Thank you.
Oh, no problem at all. All right, so jumping into the first question, what is social network analysis?
Well, it's the study of social relations among people, and instead of focusing on individuals only and their characteristics, attributes, qualities, and flaws, we focus on the relations among individuals as part of a subgroup, an organization. So that's the focus on social relations among people and what they mean, and the extraction of meaning from these social relations.
Okay.
Yeah, the analysis part is just it's the second step. Not all social networks mean that there will be an analysis of them. But when we do analyze networks and extract meaning from them, it means that we apply a set of methods to the data, to the network data, in order to extract meaning specifically from them. Typically, we would describe networks and people in them in terms of their centrality. So those would be individuals that are really important in the network. We can also, and we have a set of methods in social network analysis that describe the network as a whole. And for example, people would look at the density of the network, how much, to the extent to which people are densely connected in the network or more loosely connected. We could also describe a network in terms of being centralized around a few nodes or decentralized, so sparse, so that many different nodes could be important to the network and not one in particular.
Okay, and why should police agencies use social network analysis? How is it beneficial to them?
That's a great question, and it's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit over the last 10 years. But every time I looked at the ways of doing things in terms of criminal intelligence, targeting, target selection, we always think that more information is better. And it's a unique type of information that network data give you. It's like a roadmap that we typically would have and need in order to design a route for our vacation from going to point A to point B. We do look at street segments and the best route to go through. It's the exact same thing with social network analysis. I feel that if I'm going to try to reduce crime in a community, I want to know who's who. I want to know who do they know, who's important. And if I don't have that information, I'm treating these individuals almost like silos, as isolates, and the kinds of decisions that I'm making just lack that extra information I would need, not just to select targets, but also to make kinds of scenarios of crime reduction. For example, what's going to happen if we remove that person and that gang and that group from the drug dealing scene or the gang landscape in a community? Who else is going to take that role? And that sort of replacement thinking is much easier when you have a roadmap and you can see the gangs and the landscape in terms of their connections of alliances and conflicts, for example.
Okay. And how is social network analysis similar or different than what crime analysts or internal planning units are already doing?
Well, it's the close cousin. I think, as I said the first time, it's very close, especially if the analysts are using IBase and I2 and they're thinking in terms of link charts in order to describe the sequence, and the way that, for example, a gang is working or a drug dealing scheme is working. It's the exact same thing. We're trying to make this systematic in terms of from the coding to the analysis. So if the coding is systematic, for example, we only include individuals and their relations in the coding, and then we can extract meaning and numbers from these networks. If people then have special characteristics, if they own a warehouse in which the drugs are stored, for example, they have a vehicle that they're driving that belongs to them or to a girlfriend or to someone else, then we can also incorporate this in the analysis, but in perhaps in a different way that the link chart would do. We stack these attributes on top of the people, the nodes or the individuals in the network, as opposed to including them as a link itself. So all of this to say that it's not very far from what many analysts are trying to do, trying to get a lay of the land of what's going on, and sometimes putting it on paper to visualize it. And the visualization element is an important part of social network analysis as well. But what it does, maybe that a link chart analysis wouldn't do, is to provide that some people would say quantification. We can apply and rank people, for example, based on their importance in the network, and we can make our decisions and our understanding of the network also by using the numbers if we want. So that's that extra step. And that comes with social network analysis that's typically not found for those who are in criminal intelligence, not using the tools and methods of social network analysis just yet, but they're right on the verge, and that sort of instinct to use link chart is the same instinct that we're capitalizing on with social network analysis. It's not that much different.
Okay. And is there any resistance from law enforcement to use social network analysis? If so, why is that the case, and is there a way to overcome it?
Well, as I said in the other video, I find myself in social circles in which there's less and less resistance if I'm invited. But at the same time, I do encounter that skepticism in any room in which I present on this stuff. So, and I believe that skepticism is healthy. It's important. If we would just find a new method and go and run with it, and not asking ourselves the proper questions of whether that will work, whether it's worth it, does it add value to what we're already doing? Is it just a sexy new method that we're using, and it's going to disappear as soon as we find something else? So all of these questions are important to answer. And personally, myself, before I jumped, both feet into, the social networks world, I asked myself these same questions, because if I'm going to do this in my career in academia and do it effectively, I need to be able to probably devote all of my time to it. So is it worth it? What am I going to miss in terms of other methods available to criminologists in my research if I devote all of my time and energy to collecting network data? And of course, the answers to these questions were positive, in supporting the transfer of the time and energy to network data. And I did the same exercise, putting myself in the shoes of law enforcement officials and analysts I was meeting. Is it worth their time and effort to do this? And the answer is typically yes. So that's what I try to go through when I present, and I try to introduce these methods to in law enforcement circles. And that resistance, I welcome it, and if there's no resistance, then I question it. And at the same time, we need that sort of openness, to new ways and new methods. And the last bit is perhaps, in terms of resistance, some like the idea, but they don't see how to implement, how to change everything that we do now, all the processes and procedures that we have in place in order to welcome this new method that may change everything that we're doing, and it's costly. So all of those questions are important to answer. So I believe that resistance to a certain extent can be healthy, as long as there's also that openness to see and sort of project and imagine a different way of doing things.
And so now introducing the concept of gangs a little bit more into the conversation, what are the advantages and limitations of a social network analysis approach to the policing of gangs?
Well, there's definitely a lot of pros and cons. I think uh, one of the benefits, and not to repeat everything we've said up to now, but one of the benefits is to see the larger social structure in which gangs are involved. There's a tendency, and it's a natural tendency, in the criminal justice system to focus on individuals, on labels, on gangs. So let's say a gang becomes a priority. We follow the gang members, the people that we know that are members of this gang, and then we try to build a case around them. With social network analysis, we follow relations among people and connections. We don't necessarily follow the labels. So I think it's good to have a starting point, a well-known gang member, the target of an investigation. But when we follow the relations around that person and the people in that gang, we find a lot of diversity typically in terms of the people who are involved and connected. So that's one of the benefits of using social network analysis, is that we see that it's much more complicated sometimes than we think. The alliances, within the gang are also a little bit more complex. We see a lot of non-gang members entering the picture. We see a lot of guests to the organizations. We see that membership is much more of a fuzzy concept than sometimes we typically assumed. And with this, it brings also a limitation, or a downside of this, is that we could have the tendency to open it up too much and go a little bit too far away from the gang members and the people that are causing, say, the most violence in a community. And then the web of affiliations becomes something that we follow perhaps a little bit too far. And then it loses its meaning. So if we would, for example, follow connections and then assume that anyone who's connected to these gang members are also members of the gang, I think it would be probably wrong most of the time. We would have a lot of false positives, to use the way that we typically describe these sorts of attributions that are not necessarily true. At the same time, I see the advantage of opening it up and not forgetting people that could be important, just because we only follow the people that have the label already attached to them. So I see the benefit, but I also see the danger. And so for to I guess alleviate some of these concerns, you need proper training. You need to be, knowing what you're doing, knowing the dangers and the limitations, and submit these new individuals that you find, or these new findings from looking at network data that you did not expect, as hypotheses, as questions to be tested, people to have maybe on the radar, with a very healthy skepticism as to whether these people should even be part of the investigation or not. So I see these kinds of benefits. And very quickly, from the research on gang networks up to now, we found out that that's the best way to determine gang boundaries. For example, finding a core, a periphery, and if that's important for the gang, following network data will allow you to do this. We found from network studies that one of the most important predictors of whether a youth gang, some teenage group that come together in high school years, will become a criminal organization later, will sort of get promoted to the adult criminal careers, if you will, is whether they have those connections to mentors. So adult criminals, veterans with experience, who take them under their wing. So by following the connections, as opposed to following the people that are, for example, labeled as gang members, you find that some of these connections are between, well-known offenders or veterans with younger individuals. And these connections, when you find them, for me, are a much more interesting way of looking and sort of trying to predict what's going to happen in the gang landscape in an area. If a gang of 16-year-olds are only connected to themselves and not connected to adult criminals or mentors, they're likely to die after high school, and that transition to adulthood will be probably very significant for them and their demise. But if they have that other group of veterans surrounding them in that network, then chances are that this group that may not look like anything right now as 16 or 17-year-old, that group may become important down the road and graduate to become an adult criminal group of interest down the road. So In terms of benefits, that's one more benefit that I see in following connections. Remembering the dangers of doing so in terms of interpreting, who's who and what it means.
And do traditional police actions in the context of gangs generally target the periphery or the network core? And what are the strengths or weaknesses of such an approach?
Well, I believe they try. They try to target the core if they can. There's a belief that there is a core to almost any group. There's a decision-making core, and if you remove the core, then you'll get the benefits that you're looking for in terms of disruption, in terms of even proportionality. Just due process in terms of finding the proper, most violent criminals to charge and prosecute. Whether they succeed is a research question for me, and it's a question you can also even answer within criminal intelligence circles, because not all groups have a core first. So if you're looking for a core and the group doesn't have a core, then what do you do? So searching for the core is a matter comes after you collected the data and you connected the dots together. The other thing is that on the periphery, you may have very important people there that if ignored, could replace the core or continue to let's say it's a drug market or drug trafficking venture. They could continue to distribute drugs the same way that they did before, especially if the core is easily replaced. So on the periphery, sometimes we find people that are less visible to law enforcement. We find the brokers, the people who are connecting subgroups together. So I think everyone, in a way should be considered. I think the tendency and instinct to target the core is not necessarily a bad one. In some cases, it may bring the most value. And what I think brings value is violence reduction. You need to sort of measure these outcomes in order to know that you're doing the right thing. I don't think disruption just for virtue of disruption, matters very much, but I think disruption in terms of bringing less drugs or, if you can, but mostly violence reduction. Those are worthy goals for sure, as long as you're aware of the dangers, because it can backfire on you. And in targeting the core, you may also, if you're successful, send a signal to other gangs and groups that there's a vacuum, there's a hole here, a structural hole, we would call it in network terms, to be filled, maybe by another group who can come in and replace them. And that happens all the time, whether or not you're using network data. But what happens when you have the map of social connections is that you may be able to tell whether that's going to happen and how quickly, and who are the likely offenders who may be invited to replace the group that you targeted in the first place. You can probably make those predictions, at least internally.
Okay, and how can the police go about implementing social network analysis as part of their approach to gangs within their jurisdiction? And can you recommend any resources that people can look into if they're interested in this area?
Well, it's a great question. I think you need a champion. Like as in anything, we may be talking about social network analysis and implementation of anything new, but unless you have a manager in a criminal intelligence unit that is behind it, you're not going to go anywhere. You also need a champion crime intelligence analyst or crime analyst also to take this on. It's not the manager who's going to spend the time in training for the most part. It's going to be the analysts, and they're going to be the ones who are invited to show results from their efforts. And so I think those having that motivation, like having a champion means you have people who are motivated to make this work. I think that's important, because without motivation, it may seem like pretty challenging to learn and implement. So the motivation needs to be there, but and then you need the training. So I visited agencies that trained online, trained on their own. You have a particularly motivated analyst who will do this in their spare time and during the weekend, online courses at universities that they're doing on the side, and I think that's very, very good. It shows a willingness to at least train and get this going. But at the same time, I've also seen people just running with the measures that are extracted from a few of these software, but not understanding really what they mean. Many analysts working with I2, for example, will maybe extract these numbers that come with the software, but they don't know what to do with them, or maybe they're not sure whether they did the right thing and they have the right coding. So for that, you have training. I give training, all the time myself, but there's nothing systematic that exists, say, at SFU. It comes from, informal visits to law enforcement agencies, and then, if the motivation for training is there and there's enough people who are interested and agencies can get together, they contact me and I try to organize something. But I think that part is important. There are online courses, there are summer schools all across the globe, some of them online too, as I said. So I think that part is important. The other part to training is that network analysis, to the extent that it will show to be important in what analysts are doing, could be incorporated even more in typical strategic crime analysis courses that analysts follow every year in BC or Ottawa. It has a role, it has a place. I think there's a small component, maybe a few hours, a few minutes to a course, but I think proper training to go a little bit deeper could be beneficial. And the last thing for implementation is data, and the data is already there. It's a matter of coding it, of knowing how to structure our Excel spreadsheets, in a way that we can extract those networks and extract meaning from them. But it's not a matter of whether the data is already there or we need to build a whole new system. The system and most software use Excel. As a baseline, many software are free. So basically it's a matter of training and a matter of motivation. But it's already there for the taking. It's a matter of just making that small leap.
All right, perfect. Okay, so that's it for today's supplementary video. Thank you again, Martin, for taking time out of your day for a second time. And thank you to all of our viewers.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
No problem at all.
Yeah.